But I try to capture a moment that's full of passion, that has the feeling in it. Because for me, rock and roll is about freedom. It's about the freedom to express your feelings very loudly in public. And that's the moment that I try to capture on the picture. That moment when everybody in the audience is screaming yay and nobody's thinking about paying the rent. You know, that moment of freedom, of just being alive.
You're listening to Staring at the World with BoDeans, Kurt Newman, a T. Torrance Productions original podcast.
Hey everybody, this is Kurt Newman, and this is the Staring at the World podcast, podcast about the creative element in everyday life with people. Today we have an interview with Mr. Bob Gruen, who's a legendary photographer for many, 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 many years. He's worked with everybody, and it's part one of our interview with him. There's going to be a part two, and listen in because he talks about everything from his childhood on all the way to today in the two different interviews. And man, he tells some great stories. It's really interesting stuff. I was certainly interested, so join us. Welcome, everybody. I'm Kurt Newman, and today we are staring at the world with Mr. Bob Gruen, legendary rock and roll photographer. If you don't know him by name, you certainly know his photos because they have been everywhere for a long, long time. He's had showings in Museum of Modern Art, Sotheby's S2 Gallery, and many, many more. He's been known as the man who's in the right place at the right time, and you have a new book out, your memoirs, called Right Place, Right Time, and the life. Oh, and he's gone.
I'm here.
The life of a rock and roll photographer. There he goes.
I'm here. I just wanted to get my book.
There it is. I looked for it, and I understand that it's selling out fast, so it's hard to get a hold of.
Yes, and they've just made yesterday actually, the paperback edition was released.
It's great. So
it's now paperback, which means that the hardcover is going to start to get rare.
Yeah.
But they're still available online. But I don't think they're going to make more hardcovers once they start making softcover.
Yeah. Well, people want to see it. People want to read the stories because you were in all of the right places at the right time for all of the legendary rock and roll music that was going on. And before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about you and your life and start way back when, in your humble beginnings as a child. I found it interesting, like the story of you coming up and your childhood and getting into photography and stuff like that. So can you tell me a little bit about your life as a child and where you came from and how you grew up?
Well, I started out very young, actually, a long time ago. No, my mom, my mother and father were both attorneys. We lived on Long Island, and my mom, I think when I was 5, we got a new house, and my mom built her own darkroom because her hobby was photography. Not in an art sense or in any kind of commercial sense, but just she enjoyed taking pictures of the family, but then developing and printing her own pictures. I think she learned how to save money in the Depression, and it's just there's a lot cheaper if you do it yourself. And back in those days, photography was something that they didn't really have a lot of point and shoot cameras, the kind of photography that's available today. So my mom actually was a photographer. She developed and printed her own pictures. And when I was around 4 or 5 years old, and I was too big to go to sleep very early, but too little to leave running around the house alone, my mom took me in the darkroom with her and started to show me how to develop pictures. And in those days, we didn't even have a tank. You had a tray of developer, and you'd have to go up and down, to keep the film lubricated and going in and out of the developer, and you'd have to count seconds in the dark while you were doing it. And I got pretty good at that, about timing and counting at the right, pace. And I really took to it, and I started taking pictures with my mom's cameras. And then when I was 8, she got me my own camera, a Brownie Hawkeye. But I became the family photographer. And I think, looking back, that was good training to be in a rock and roll situation, because you basically learn how to get 5 or 6 people who are very dysfunctional and going in different directions, all looking good for 1/60th of a second,
Right. It's tough.
And I learned that with family. So, and I started taking pictures actually when I went to summer camp when I was 11. I took pictures of the show. Summer camp had put on a show. I actually remember it was Oklahoma, and a musical play. And I was down front taking pictures with my Brownie Hawkeye. I never really liked sitting in a seat for a whole show. I always walked around and looked at things, and taking pictures. And I sent the film home to my mom, and she developed them and made some prints and sent them back to me at camp. And I sold them to the campers for $5 a piece. So I started making money as a photographer when I was 11.
Yeah. And it sounds to me like it was just a natural thing for you. I mean, if your mom's developing photos and stuff and you're kind of in that life every day, it might seem strange to someone who didn't have that around them, but for you, it was just a natural thing.
It was just part of my growing up. It was totally natural.
Right. Which,
and it was something that for me, you see, my older brother was a genius. Actually was into computers in 1958.
Wow.
He kind of person who got really upset when he got, one question wrong on the SAT. He got a 789 or something instead of an 800. But this was something in photography, was something that I could do really well, that I could do better than him. One of the few things, where I was the better one. So I really took to it, in that sense early on. Yeah,
which is one of the things I'm doing with this podcast, excuse me, is trying to focus on what I call a creative element in people. It's because I wasn't a kid who did really well in school at all. In fact, I had to learn how to do workarounds for everything in school because I couldn't pass the spelling and math tests and stuff. So that's what I did. And I sometimes think, though, that if that was a natural environment around you as a kid growing up, that can really enhance that part. It can seem normal to you, where like I kind of had to find it on my own because my parents were more of the everyday world. My mom was a nurse. My dad was in sales. And so there was no creativity around me. I had to kind of discover it as a workaround myself. And I just feel like when I heard some of these things your parents were saying to you, like you said they taught you to question everything, and it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. Those are not things my parents were saying to me, and so I just...
Well, they didn't make a point of that. I mean, my parents were lawyers, and they were relatively conservative, and actually expected me to grow up and wear a suit and tie and have an office to go to. And that just didn't work out for me.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. That's exactly for me too. That's exactly where I was coming from. But it's
very interesting. Patti Smith talks about how all the people hanging out at CBGBs were the losers, the ones who didn't get any grades, who didn't do well in school, and we all kind of hung out. And everybody who, in retrospect, it seems like everybody who got drunk at CBGBs for all those years turned into somebody.
Yeah,
like Neil, Patti Smith, Richard Hell, Debbie and Chris, from Blondie. I mean, all those people. We all dropped out of school.
Yeah,
school didn't work for us, but CBGBs was a place where we learned a lot. Learned how to get along with each other, learned how to entertain people, learned how to make a living.
I think so. I think for me, here's a story. In 4th grade, a woman pulls me out of class, and I'm standing out in the hallway talking to her, and she's like, so tell me about your summer. And I didn't even know the person. I start talking, and next thing I know, a week later, I'm sitting out at a table in the hallway with a reading teacher because they're telling me I didn't read good enough and stuff. So I think, why you fall into rock and roll music and that energy and stuff like that sometimes is because you did find a connection there. And I think a lot of the people you shot and became really good friends with as your friends was that same kind of element. Would you agree with that kind of thing?
It's funny. I don't really think about it too often, but now that you're mentioning it, I think a lot of the people I know, it's kind of common to say, "Oh, I dropped out of school," or "I didn't do well in school," or it just seems like the basic education. I'm glad I learned to read and write, and add things up, but there's a lot of schooling that didn't really fit for me.
Right, but the
and for all my friends, and it's funny how rock and roll seems to save a lot of those people. It's something they can do and express themselves, and and lift other people up as well, even though it's not what they, the standard that they teach. You must go to school, you must have some kind of degree, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, my theory is, though, is with some of these rock and roll people, is that we all had to find some way to communicate, to express ourselves, because we weren't fitting in with that normal system. And that's that creative energy behind it all is kind of what led to a lot of people's successes, even if they weren't shooting for big successes as much as they were trying to communicate, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because I was not shooting for a big success. It's funny you say that.
Yeah.
In fact, I in the 60s, there was Timothy Leary had the expression, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Or no,
Right.
turn on, tune in and drop out. And basically that's what I did. I was not looking for an office job. I tried a couple of times in, the 9 to 5 world. It didn't really appeal to me because I couldn't do the 9 o'clock part.
Yeah. No, this is early for me. I'll tell you that much.
I was up, I'm much better from 5 at night till 9 in the morning.
Yeah.
Rather than the other way around. It just worked out that way. So for some people, that's just a better way.
You also said in one of your interviews that for prom, your date was a camera. And here's another thing I wondered when I heard that is with musicians, a lot of times they use their instruments or their songs to communicate with the world. And I wondered, with photography, do you do that as well? Was it easier for you to maybe kind of communicate with the world through your camera on what you were seeing, what you were feeling, and trying to capture those moments? Was that why?
So. I like to say that my favorite topic was show and tell. I always like to see exciting things, but then show it to people and tell them about it. And
Yeah.
I used to take pictures of the football games and, just the school dances. But if there was a fire in town, I would go there and take pictures of that. The first picture I had published in a newspaper was a picture of a fire in a building in the local town.
I saw that.
So, I was kind of shy. I didn't date a lot as a kid. I was one of the nerdy kids. I don't know if they even have it nowadays. I guess nowadays it would be called IT, but back then it was the audiovisual guy. That we'd have a cart that had the film strips on it or a movie projector. And when the class was going to see a movie, I was the guy who came in and knew how to run the projector and knew how to run the slideshow and do the mechanics of it. That's the opposite of the football playing, cool guys.
Yeah. But again,
Pat pointed out that all the cool guys in high school turned out to be the nerds, and the nerds turned out to be the cool people.
Yeah. And again, it seems like when you're at that age, you're kind of finding some way to fit in where you can with the world, especially when you're that young. My dad had a Kodak Signet, I think, camera. And that thing was like magic to me because, first of all, it looked so cool. It came in a brown leather case, and it was all manual, right? And I didn't really know what I was doing, but I loved the idea of it. And I would shoot up a roll of film like that. It was so fast. But back in that day, what kids don't understand now is you shot that film and you tried to get enough money to take it somewhere to get developed, or at least I did.
Yes.
And you waited to see what magic you did capture or didn't.
Well, I was developing myself to save the money. And actually, I got to the point where I would buy film in 100-foot rolls and load it into the canister myself, again, to save money. Because, kids don't realize that every time you click the shutter, you were paying for that.
Yeah.
Paying for the film and the developing, and then you had to make prints, and that all cost money. So, I was developing my own pictures just to save the money and to get it done. But true, now with the instantaneous results of a digital picture, people don't know that you had to take pictures and then go home and develop them. And until you saw the negatives, you didn't know if you even had pictures. Yeah. And then when you blew them up and printed them, then you find out if they're sharp or the focus was right and stuff. I remember several times walking out of theaters and people saying, "Did you get any good shots tonight, Bob?" And I would always answer, "I hope so."
Yeah, exactly. You just didn't
until
know.
You get home and develop it, you didn't know. And for a while, I was using the Olympus camera, which was a very good camera, very lightweight, very good quality. But it had a tricky thing where the lens would mount on the front. They were changeable lenses, but right behind where the lens mounted was where the speed was set. And you could sometimes accidentally turn that dial when you were putting a lens in and out. And as far as the speed, when you took a picture with a flash, it would only synchronize with the flash at slower speeds, under a 60th of a second. So if you accidentally clicked that up to 125th of a second, you only got half a frame.
Yeah.
And you didn't know that until you pulled out a roll of film and you saw that all of it was just half frames and half the people in the picture were not there.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult to explain if you were being paid to have those people in the picture. It didn't happen often. You learned after the first time to always check every time you change the lens, but every once in a while that would happen, and it was disastrous.
Yeah. I didn't even know it was possible.
You didn't have a picture.
Yeah. It was all kind of guesswork. I'm wondering, that process of shooting like that and developing it yourself in the darkroom, I know for some photographers that darkroom actually could become part of the creative process, as well as how much you pushed a photo or overdeveloped it, or some people would mix images and stuff like that and create their own kind of photographic art form like that as well, which you have computer editing today, but it seems so different than what was going on in the darkrooms.
It's very different. Actually, I find the computer editing to be an awful lot simpler and much more efficient, and you can do a lot more than you could manually. I personally was never really good in the darkroom, even just trying to get the contrast and everything. I was always in a rush. It took me years to learn to slow down and actually let the whole picture develop and get the details to come out.
Right.
But as far as doing any kind of fancy effects of, merging pictures together and things like that, it's much easier in Photoshop than it is in the darkroom.
It is, but I sometimes feel like I used to shoot with the 3200 black and white, which was super grainy, but it just had such a character that I can't find in any kind of modern day photography.
High-speed recording film. That was a genius invention when I discovered the high-speed recording film. And then I actually pushed that in the Acufine developers. So it was actually 6400 ASA, which is an amazing film since I was always working with musicians who like to work in the dark, especially in recording studios. It's like the brightness of candlelight. And when I got that recording film, the high speed, I was able to take pictures in the studios. But you're right. It was a very soft film. In other words, very low contrast. Everything was a shade of gray. Yeah. There was no blacks and no whites.
Yeah.
But you got a picture. It was also very grainy.
Very grainy, and it had such a vibe to it I love it. I compare it to like listening to a record on vinyl compared to listening to a streaming song today. There was just a warmth, a character about the photograph when you shot with that kind of film that I just don't see today as much. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just saying it seems like there's a difference to them, and you can really do a lot with both.
Well, there is a big difference. There's some people who are very, choosy about the quality of the film, and the film has more depth than the video, than the digital picture, which is true. Yeah. But for myself, I was never that interested in the quality of a picture. I was more interested in the moment and the feeling and what the picture was showing and how a person would react when they saw the picture.
Right.
Because my theme is not just pop portraits and to show the news of, who was singing last night. But I try to capture a moment that's full of passion, that has the feeling in it. Because for me, rock and roll is about freedom. It's about the freedom to express your feelings very loudly in public. And that's the moment that I try to capture on the picture. That moment when everybody in the audience is screaming yay, and nobody's thinking about paying the rent. That moment of freedom, of just being alive. Right. And I try to capture some of that in the picture. So for me, if it's a little green or a little gray or a little, soft and the focus wasn't sharp, that's not what I was looking for.
Yeah.
I was looking for excitement and freedom.
Yeah.
Passion.
And you captured it many times. Some great photos. After high school and stuff and growing up, did you go to college? Did your parents make you go?
A couple of colleges. my mom and dad were pretty convinced they wanted me to go to a college and get a real life, and I had terrible grades, but my dad was a lawyer, so he had called up one of the colleges. I happened to find a brochure for Southern Illinois University. Yeah. And the picture of the college is an aerial shot that shows all the buildings around a lake with a forest in the middle. And it just looked so much more inviting than the kind of colleges that are in a city that show a sidewalk with one tree or something in front of it, or even a little bit of a green, commons in front of the buildings. Southern Illinois was had a woods and a lake, and it just seemed like a nice place, although there was no way I was going to college with my grades. But I mentioned it to my dad. I think he's, we saw the catalog or something. I come home one day, my dad said, I talked to the dean, and you're getting into the college. You're graduating high school on Friday night. The school actually starts on Tuesday, but you're going to get there Saturday morning before they close the final registration, and you're going to get into college. So the night I graduated, and I didn't get to go to any high school graduation parties. I actually went to the airport, flew to Chicago, and took a train all the way down the middle of Illinois, and I got there around 11 in the morning with a 12 o'clock deadline to register. And I remember they signed me up for classes. A big mistake was signing me up for tennis at 8 o'clock in the morning. Although I did make a couple of classes, and what was really funny was in the fall, I actually got off campus. I was in an experiment where they had undergraduates living on their own in an unsupervised dorm, and I managed to get in there and have a lot of fun. And from the first time I went to make a phone call home, it turned out in those days you had to get a long distance operator. Yeah, and long distance calls were kind of expensive. When I got the long distance operator, it turned out to be a girl from my tennis class who liked me, and she gave me free calls for the rest of the year.
Well, that's awesome.
So the tennis class actually worked out, but not the tennis.
It's not lost on me though that you're telling me it was a picture of the college that drew you to it, compared to pictures of other colleges. Once again, right. It seems like everything was very visual.
That's the extent of my interest in college. I wasn't, the only thing I wanted to do was photography. I knew that back then. Right. And I knew I wanted to go to RIP, to the Rochester Institute, which was, had funding from Kodak, which was their world headquarters was in Rochester. And it was known as the best photography school. But being the best, they required good students, people who had grades, that were above a C average, and my grades were D's and C's and the occasional E in there.
I was the same.
I got out with 1 point above the failing average because I negotiated with a teacher to please, don't make me stay here. Yeah. And he gave me the points, and I got out of school. So the fact that my dad negotiated to get me into college was I wasn't expecting it at all. But it didn't really work out because I didn't have a major other than photography. Right. And I didn't really realize Southern Illinois University actually had a very large communications school, and they probably do have a photography school. I know they were very early on the video. They had big video production stages, which I had no part of because as an incoming student who wasn't very good in high school, they were giving me basically high school classes again, English, math, history. I just had no interest in high school. So I didn't really have much interest in the classes in college. Although the first day I was there, after registering and then getting my room, they had a daily newspaper in the college, the Daily Egyptian. And I went over there and got a job as a photographer.
There you go.
My first day.
That sounds like the exact same story that I went through trying to, all my friends go off to college and you feel like you're supposed to do it. And I tried to study music, but pretty soon when I was in there, I'm like, wow, what can someone teach me about playing music that's, not in here already, And so you just don't find that place where you fit there. And I read that soon after all of that experience, you ended up in Greenwich Village. I'm guessing it's because there was an energy going on there that you felt like you did really connect with.
Well, in high school, I started going into the village on weekends to see some of the folk music bands. I was really very much getting into folk music in those days. We're talking like early 60s, 1965, around there. I think it was 65 when I actually moved into the city. And it was, kind of coming out of the beatnik area, but it was still very much a folk music scene. And my friend from high school, they started what was called back then a folk rock band, where it was like folk music, but with electric guitar, kind of, inspired by Bob Dylan's playing electric at Newport. They started singing traditional songs, but with a more of a rock and roll feeling to it.
Yeah.
And my idea, to turn on, tune in, and drop out was to live with a rock and roll band. And at that point, I was playing a little bit of folk music on guitar, and I didn't really know that you could play rhythm guitar and still be in a band, just to play chords.
Yeah.
Because Beatles came out, and they started playing good music, and all my friends started playing notes. And instead of just strumming, they were playing all these different notes and everything. And that got a little too complicated for me. I didn't want to have to learn how to do that. But around the same time, I got into the music business because my dad had a station wagon. That was my big break. I needed somebody to drive him around and carry the amps. So that was what I did. I had the car, and I could help carry the amps. And then I could take pictures of the band, because they did need pictures to put out in front of the club, or to promote the shows. So that's how I started taking pictures of bands with just my roommates. And then it was a classic story where they had broken up, and then a day or two after they broke up, one of the piano players' dad got them one last job at a party, and they played the party. And it was actually for a guy named Paul McGregor was opening the first unisex hair parlor. It was the first kind of hairdresser that was for men and women. Yeah. And the party was in honor of a book called Birds of Britain, and a producer named Bob Gruen had made a record album to go with the book. He had and Bob Gruen was the producer who produced The Four Seasons and Frankie Valli. Right. Bob Gruen had over 80 top 10 hits to his credit.
That's amazing.
He's one of the top producers in the world. He was somebody that Phil Spector and Andrew Oldham looked up to as the guy who knew how to do it. I mean, Bob Gruen, we had no idea. He was a gorgeous guy. He was a male model who took his first modeling money, and he made a song called Silhouettes on the Shade, which turned into a hit. And he quit modeling, and he became a record producer. And he was just a really nice guy. I actually became friends with him. And he made an album for my friends, The Glitter House. And the record company used my pictures, and they started to hire me to take pictures of other bands. And before you know it, instead of dropping out, I had actually fallen in. Yeah. And I was working more than I ever, expected to, because I found something I could do. I got along with musicians. I could take good pictures, and I've always been kind of a workaholic because I don't like working. For me, until the job is finished, you're still working. It's always there in your mind that you got to finish this thing. You got to develop it, or you got to make the prints or deliver them or whatever it was. So I was always rushing to get things done so I wouldn't have to work. But what turned out was I was really good, and people really liked getting their pictures right away. And I ended up working more than ever. Like, I've been working 24/7 for the last 50 years. Yeah,
you must be tired.
I do get tired nowadays. I'm a little older than I used to be, and I don't have the kind of, what do they call it, dry goods that used to help you stay awake.
Yeah, no, I know the feeling. I'm getting older, and it takes an extra step here or there. I heard you say you were at the Dylan Electric show in Newport, though, and one thing that I found interesting about when you mentioned that is, the story was that everybody hated it and booed him, but you said that wasn't quite necessarily the case.
Well, the story comes down that people booed because they didn't like the electric guitar, but what actually happened was quite chaotic because a lot of people did like him, and a lot of people were upset, but a lot of people were cheering. So you had people booing and people cheering, and then yelling at each other, because they were on opposite sides. And it was very funny. I never heard that sound again until I was at a Bob Dylan tribute, and Sinead O'Connor came out and started singing, and the audience was cheering and booing at the same time. I was like, "That's the sound." I was telling my wife, "That's the same sound," because. There was Bob Dylan had a record out at that point. I think like a Rolling Stone was already on the radio. So there were some people who were aware that he had kind of upped the tempo, and it wasn't just a quiet rock and roll, that he was playing with a driving rock and roll beat. Yeah. And, the folk music that he had been playing was kind of slower. So now it was much more rocking. Other people had played with electric guitars at Newport. I think Muddy Waters and the Chambers Brothers, other people used guitars, but in a more traditional folk kind of way. And when Bob Dylan came out, it was just rocking into the songs. The audience was like, "What's this?" And they were very upset. But like I say in the book, for me, thinking back, over the years, I realized that what Bob Dylan was doing was kind of declaring or admitting that rock and roll was the folk music of America.
Right.
Folk music is the music of the folk. It's not meant to be static and one thing all the time. It's supposed to relate the feelings of the people, and the feelings of the people at that point were rock and roll.
Yeah. And you're saying, though, in a lot of the bands, even around you in New York City at the time when you were young, were kind of buying into that they were developing that as well. It was almost the natural progression of where people were going with music.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, you don't hear about it nowadays, but there was a whole movement of folk rock.
Yeah.
Bands like the Buffalo Springfield were a folk rock band. There was a lot of bands back then. But, the Loving Spoonful was a band that came out of the folk music tug band era, but livened it up and got a drummer and started playing it as a rock and roll.
And this whole time, you're finding your place that you feel good at, but I heard you say that your parents still were on you to get a real job. I too
wanted me to get a real job most of my life. It's like, my dad, when I was, how old was I then? I guess in my 40s. I had my first big exhibit was at Studio 54 in 1982. And I had 3,000 people came, and I had about 100 pictures up. And it was very successful. My dad came to see that, and it was really nice for him to see that, no, I wasn't wearing a suit. Actually, I was wearing a tuxedo that night, I think.
Yeah.
But the fact that my rock and roll had succeeded and that so many people appreciated it, and I was obviously a success in a field that, was not the one that he expected. And my mom came to a couple of early ones. I had a big one in New York, but my mom actually came when I had a big exhibit in Sao Paulo in 2008. I had a massive exhibit, 280 pictures in a really big, well-financed. We had a huge budget that the college had a great budget that they gave me. And my mom came to see that. And the mayor of Sao Paulo and the national senator from Sao Paulo, who were both the parents of a good friend of mine who helped me organize the show, they were there. And my mom was a lawyer who was always interested in politics. So I got to introduce my mom to the mayor of the city and to the senator from the state.
Wow.
And it was like a real conversation, like, hey, I really did do something with this rock and roll. It wasn't all just being drunk in a bar every night.
But in the 60s, they were probably still wondering what the hell you were doing, right?
I was definitely the black sheep of the family.
Yeah. I went through that as well. Yeah, same thing of just telling my mom, she suggested if I like playing guitars or drums that I should become an electrician because I could work on amps. And I just looked at her and shook my head. And it wasn't until I think my grandfather, who was the patriarch of the family, had sent some pictures of me in the newspaper playing in a band that they felt like, oh, maybe we can let him do this for a while.
Yeah.
After
it takes a while, for parents to let the kids go and find their own way, because certainly for me, my own way didn't seem profitable. It was still not very profitable.
Or practical.
Practical. It didn't seem like something you could really survive and pay a rent with,
Yeah. But what I noticed is with me and people who get into rock and roll and that thing we were talking about earlier of not necessarily fitting into the system, it all kind of goes together and gets you to that place. You're doing what you feel you have to do. And it's odd to some people, it doesn't fit in, but like you were saying about Patti Smith and stuff, all of a sudden you find that it did work and somehow it was the right direction to go. From that shooting photography in those early years, can you tell us the story of meeting Ike then? He saw one of your photographs and you got to go on the road with Ike and Tina Turner.
Yeah, that was actually my big break. I was into photography. I'd take pictures of my friends. I had met a record company and they asked me to take a couple of pictures of some bands. But a friend of ours told us that Ike and Tina Turner were playing and that Tina was totally amazing. We had to go and see her. And we took her up on it. We went to see Ike and Tina opening for Sam and Dave here at the Felt Forum in New York. And I was absolutely blown away. I'd never seen anything so exciting and so mesmerizing. as Tina Turner dancing with the Ikettes and the music and the whole feeling of the whole thing. And they played a few shows around New York that week. Like when they came to one place, they play a few different places. So they played that show. The next night they were in a club on Long Island called the Honkamonka Room. I can't make that kind of stuff up.
Yeah.
But at the Honkamonka Room, it was very funky. It was like a bar with a basement room. And I remember the linoleum floor. The stage was about a foot high, a small stage. Somehow they managed to get 4 horns, a drummer, bass and guitar, a piano player, an Ike Turner, and 3 Ikettes dancing, and Tina, all on that one little stage. But that night, I brought my camera. I was so excited the first night I saw that I brought a camera the next night, and I took a bunch of pictures just for myself, just to remember it.
Yeah.
And then a couple of days later, we went to see Ike and Tina again. There was a theater in and around in New Jersey, and we went there, and I brought the pictures mostly just to show my friend Judy. And as we were walking out, Judy saw Ike Turner going from one dressing room to another, and she pushed me and said, show Ike the pictures. And he stopped and he said, what pictures? He had a real deep voice. What pictures? And I said, well, I have these pictures from the other night. And he goes, oh, yeah, I had a feeling somebody was taking pictures that night. I felt they were getting the right moment. And he looked at the pictures. He goes, man, these pictures are great. I got to show these to Tina. And he took me in the dressing room, and all of a sudden I was standing next to Tina Turner, and she was looking at my pictures and she was liking them. And I had trouble breathing because she was so real and so sexy and so earthy. And there was not one bit of the diva about her. She was just a grounded, really nice, warm, open person. She always was. I mean, the entire time I know her. And I said he wanted to buy some of the pictures. He said, meet me in New York on Monday. I'll take you to the record company. And the guy he introduced me to at the record company, Marv Greifinger, took me to a party and introduced me to a couple of more people. And things just started snowballing from there. I started meeting more and more people. One of the guys I met at the party was Billy Smith. He talked the record company into hiring me to take pictures of a guy who was a brand new piano player from England who was opening for Leon Russell, a guy named Elton John. Yeah. So I got in early on that, and Elton liked my pictures, and I worked for him for the next couple of years every time he came to New York. He skyrocketed. He was an opening act at the Fillmore. 6 months later, he was the headliner at the Fillmore. A few months after that, he was headlining at Carnegie Hall. And he came back. It might have even been the same year, or maybe a year later, he was headlining Madison Square Garden. Yeah. He just shot up from, everybody loved him. He was great. And I just lucked out that I was there at the beginning. Yeah.
With Ike and Tina, though, did you...
I've been lucky that way to get to know a band when they first started out. And they liked my pictures, and I just stayed with them as we got bigger and bigger.
Oh, yeah. No, I remember people giving me photos on our early tours just being knocked out by certain people who were really good at their job. But with Ike and Tina, they took you out with them on the road eventually on a tour, and did you do a film on the road documentary?
Yeah, one thing led to another. It kind of developed over a year or so. I mean, looking back, it seemed pretty quick, but, at the time, it took time. But because I saw when they came to New York, and then I think they were in New York again for something. But then the following summer, they played a show, and I took a bunch of pictures of them. And that was the first time I made a videotape. In the end of 1970, I bought a Sony Portapack videotape. It was the first portable video machine that was available for consumers. Right. The idea of being able to film a videotape costs $10 for a half an hour reel. In order to make a movie, costs a lot more than that. For a 3-minute roll, it costs more than $10. And then you'd have to get it developed, which was another $10, $15, $20. And then you needed a projector and a screen and a place to show it. And that was all, a week later at best. With videotape, you could record something and then immediately show it back on any TV, on a monitor, in a dressing room, or in a hotel room right after the show. And so I made a videotape for Ike and Tina Turner when they played Central Park. In those days, things were a lot easier. I could just walk in front of the audience with the camera and take pictures. Nobody asked for permission, some passes or anything. And Tina loved the fact that she could see the show right after it happened, go over it with the Ikettes and say, oh, look, we should turn left there instead of turning right. And they would improve the act that way. Because it was the first time that a band could see themselves performing, especially right after the thing. Even if they were on TV, they generally wouldn't get to see it because TV was generally live or the band itself wouldn't have access to any kind of recording of the show.
Right.
So the video, the Sony video was the first time that bands got to see themselves. And so Ike and Tina liked that. And it wasn't so much that they took us on the road as we would just show up and they would just take us along and get us plane tickets and keep us there as long as they could.
Yeah.
Because that summer, I took a picture when they were in the Bronx, and I made a print, and it was a classic picture of Tina in profile with a spotlight coming down across the frame, a big blue light right onto Tina. And looking at it, it just seemed like a really good picture that could be an album cover.
Right.
And I knew by that time, I knew enough about the chaos of Ike and Tina's organization. I mean, by that time, Ike was taking a bunch of coke, and things were kind of chaotic. And
I wanted to ask you about that too.
I couldn't mail the picture to the office and expect anybody to show it to Ike for me. So there was a day I saw they were playing in Washington. I woke up that morning and thought, well, if I go to Washington, I can show them the picture and see what happens.
Yeah.
It turned out to be a long day. I went to the wrong airport. I ended up spending the rest of my money trying to get out to the right hotel, only to find out they'd moved hotels. And I hitchhiked back to Baltimore to find them. Anyway, I finally got to the dressing room.
Wow.
I came in and I showed Ike the picture. And he looked at me and said, that's a great picture. What are you doing tomorrow? And I said, well, I didn't have a plan for tomorrow. He said, all right, I'll get Ron to get you a ticket. You can come out to L.A. for a week, take some more pictures. And all of a sudden, I spent a week in Los Angeles. And actually, when he said come to Los Angeles, he gave me a hit of coke. And I was kind of naive. I didn't even really know what it was at that point. And I didn't go to sleep. He kept giving me coke all week. I mean, there's a lot of coke around Ike Turner. And I didn't go to that was Saturday afternoon. I didn't go to sleep till the following Friday night.
How much of a culture shock was that for you, going from growing up to being in a situation like that? When I had never even been on a plane ride until the record company flew us out to LA for the first time. So everything about that experience for me was new and crazy and wild. And what I'm hearing is was it like that for you too? You went from your childhood and hanging out in New York to all of a sudden you're doing coke in LA.
Yes, it was quite a jump. I mean, it wasn't my first time on a plane, but it was the first time traveling in that sense with a band. It was very exciting.
Yeah.
For me, somehow I'm able to take things in stride.
Yeah, right. You'd have to.
And just take each day as it comes and not freak out over any of it, but enjoy it. And, but it was quite surprising to suddenly.
Did you see much of, when I was growing up, there was a lot of famous stories about Ike Turner and his violence and his anger and stuff. Did you have to deal with a lot of that? Was that around you at all when you were there?
None of it. It's really interesting how Ike has been labeled as such a violent man. And certainly the movie that they made really showed the violent side of him. Yeah. And, what's love got to do with it? And I think that movie was very important. And, Tina Turner writing the book and talking about what happened and how she felt about it is extremely important. It really opened up a conversation that had not been open before that.
Right.
The whole idea of domestic violence was something that people didn't talk about.
Right.
It was in a lot of senses just taken for granted. Like she was your woman, what was the problem? I mean, you loved her, but if she did something wrong, you smacked her. And that's the way people were. That's the way Ike's family was. That's the way all the families around him grew up. For a long time, nobody questioned that. Until Tina made it so public that they started questioning it, which is a very good thing because a lot of people need that kind of help.
Yeah.
To be, there's an organization called Her Justice. It's one of the charities that I help support because it's a lot of lawyers who do pro bono work for domestic violence victims. And that wouldn't have happened without Tina bringing that story into the public. But as far as me seeing it, it was not a daily thing.
Yeah.
So I could hit anybody. Ike Turner was one of the most generous people I've ever met in my life. Right. Whatever anybody needed who was near Ike, he gave them. If they needed a job, if they needed a house, if they needed a car, Ike was very, very generous. At his funeral, Little Richard was talking about how one time when he was down and Ike lent him some money, it was no questions asked. It wasn't a loan. It was just, here, you need it, you got it.
Right.
Ike was a very smart person. He learned early on that a booking agent basically calls up a club and says, I got a band and can they play next Tuesday? And then they get 10% for setting up the gig.
They sure do.
So I thought, I can call a club. And I opened up his own agency and he started booking not only himself, but he had at one point 100 different musicians and 20 different bands that he was organizing and booking shows for. He had his own publishing company. You talk about the electronics. Ike loved electric gadgets in his guitar and in his studio. He built his own studio out in Los Angeles. He had 2 studio rooms.
Yeah.
And whenever he'd meet somebody on the road who told him, I can build this little box that does this kind of reverb or does some kind of something, Ike would fill the kid with coke, bring him to LA, keep him awake for a week and have him do what he could do, which is what he did to me. But there was always some kid at the control board screwing some kind of new box that he just invented into the panel.
And from what I understand,
I never saw Ike, hit anybody. But that said, if you hit somebody, you don't ever have to hit them again for years. You could just lift your fist.
Yeah.
And personal cringe because they don't want to be hit again.
They sure don't. Yeah.
So
I learned that with my old man as well. You just do not.
Well, my parents were lawyers. They didn't drink or get too violent.
From Ike, then, did Ike move you into meeting with the John and Yoko type relationship that you developed after that? Was he a part of that at all?
Oh, Ike, no. Like I said, one thing kind of led to another where I was working with Ike and Tina and Elton John and started to work with more bands. And then I met, when I was in a book called The Photography of Rock. It was the first book of rock and roll photographers. There was like 12 different photographers, and I was included in that.
What year was that? What year was that?
That was 1972.
72.
And it was finished in early 72, like January, February. I did an interview, I think in March, with the writer, Henry Edwards, who was writing the biographies of all the photographers. And for some reason, he took a liking to me and my pictures. And at the end of my interview, he said, I'm going to interview John and Yoko next week. Would you like to come and take pictures for that? And I was extremely excited. I mean, John and Yoko had come to New York in the summer, and there were news reports that they were around town. Within a couple of weeks or months, we found out they actually lived around the corner from me in Greenwich Village, literally half a block away. But, you don't go and stand outside their house and try to bother them or anything, although, some people wanted to. But I was hoping to meet John and Yoko. I saw them one time when they played at a benefit, the Apollo Theater. It was the first time I saw them. There was a benefit for the prisoners, families of the prisoners who were killed at Attica Prison.
Oh, right.
And they played there. Aretha Franklin was there, which is why I went. And all of a sudden, John and Yoko were in the theater, and they were on stage. And I spoke to John a moment. I mean, they were waiting for their ride backstage. And people had those little Instamatic cameras, and they were taking some snapshots. And John kind of said, people are always taking our picture. We never see these pictures. Whatever happens to these pictures? And I spoke up. I said, well, I live around the corner from you. I'll show you my pictures. And he said, oh, you live around the corner? Well, slip them under the door, And it sounded very neighborly. So I didn't slip them under the door. I rang the bell. But much to my surprise, Jerry Rubin answered the door.
Right.
He happened to be visiting, and he opened the door for them. But he said, are they expecting you? And I said, no, I'm just leaving this for them. And I left. I gave him the pictures. I left. And Yoko remembered that because almost nobody just came and gave them something without trying to meet them. And she was like, well, who's that guy? Because they liked my pictures and they hadn't met me. And it wasn't until a few months later when Henry brought me to the interview that it was really more one-on-one with John and Yoko. And I took some pictures and they liked the pictures I took that night. They were recording with the Elton's Memory Band. And the story that Henry and I were working on was actually about the band. It wasn't about John and Yoko. So I asked if I could come to the studio to take pictures of them together. And they said, okay. And then they liked the pictures that I did that night. And they used one of them inside the cover of the Sometime in New York City album. And at that point, they told me to come around more often and to take pictures whenever I wanted, and that they would give me total access.
Yeah.
And
that's amazing.
And that's worked. I'm still friends with Yoko today.
This is the Staring at the World podcast. I thank you for listening today and joining us. It means a lot that you listen, and hopefully you can subscribe to it and, make us part of your listening experience. I'm going to continue to interview interesting people about the creative element, and it makes for good stories, good listening. So join us, make us part of your everyday existence. We love you. Here's a hug. Feel that?
Thanks for listening to Staring at the World with BoDeans, Kurt Newman, a podcast about creative innovation. Please be sure to download, subscribe, rate, and review, and keep listening wherever you get your podcasts.